If your company is remote or hybrid, then you know how hard it can be for employees to build meaningful connections with each other. Well, this week's sponsor is here to solve that, and they are called Mystery. Mystery has changed the way that I even think about employee engagement. They use the power of data and virtual events to drive employee connections. I actually recently attended a Mystery demo, and let me tell you, I learned so much about the potential behind employee engagement and how Mystery's events drive connection and belonging. So I'm excited to share that there is a special promotion for listeners of my podcast. Thanks to Mystery, you can get your first 2 Mystery events for the price of 1. That is right, 2 events for the price of 1. So if you're looking for a way to improve employee engagement and drive connection in your organization, I highly recommend checking them out. Go to trymystery.com/HR-podcast. That's trymystery.com/HR-podcast to get this special offer. Plus, I've added the link in the show notes so you can just click there. Now, let's get back to the podcast. Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Tracy Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week. Before we go any further, don't forget to rate, review, subscribe. Give this video a thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. Wherever you're listening or watching this podcast, make sure you love it, like it, share it, whatever you've got to do to share the wealth. This week, I have Kevin Campbell, who is an employee experience scientist at Qualtrics, on the podcast. And we are going to talk about some really, really exciting topics. And we're going to dig into a whole side of HR and the employee experience that I have yet to touch, which is really employee and HR analytics. And we're going to really dive in deep. So let me tell you a little bit about Kevin. He partners with Qualtrics customers to link employee experience programs with desired business and customer outcomes. Kevin's advisory services include defining roadmaps and governance models, delivering end-user training, and consulting on activating an employee experience mindset within organizations. Using a data-driven approach, Kevin delivers insights by connecting feedback across employee touchpoints and mapping out operational data to uncover the hidden drivers of performance, engagement, customer satisfaction, and retention. Kevin's thought leadership has been featured in articles and presentations from notable organizations including Strategic HR Review, the Gallup Business Journal, International Coach Federation, and Society for Human Resources Management, aka SHRM. So without further ado, welcome Kevin to the podcast. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Tracy.
Oh my gosh. I'm so excited that you're here because you are an expert in analytics and how we measure employee experience just fundamentally. And I can tell you, I'm not an expert in that. So I love having folks like you on who can kind of help us dive deeper into a really important subject like this. So before we get into that, tell us a little bit about how you became an employee experience scientist. What does that mean?
Yeah. So, an employee experience scientist is essentially somebody with a background in organizational psychology that likes to apply that learning and that research to the real world. So my background in people and HR related topics started as a headhunter. So I was recruiting semiconductor engineers for companies like Intel and Samsung. And I was pretty good at that to the point where I got picked up by Google to work as an internal headhunter for them, a technical sourcer, not to be confused with a sorcerer, but I was headhunting top engineering talent from around the world. And it was in that process that I realized here I am working for the best place to work according to all the workplace lists at the time. But there was still a high degree of variance in terms of how engaged and happy people were with their role. And for anyone that's ever worked in recruiting, there were times where I thought I found a perfect candidate, but the hiring manager or the hiring committee wouldn't agree. So I wanted to find a more objective way of measuring people's potential for success and for measuring the employee experience and finding out what really makes people happy at work. So I did a bit of a pivot, went back to grad school to study organizational psychology. And I have actually a co-concentration in positive psychology, which is the study of happiness. So really what makes people happy at work and in their work life. And my first role outside of grad school was working for the Gallup organization. So implementing employee experience surveys and their famous Q12, along with strengths-based coaching and learning and development. And since then, I've been on a journey, worked with a lot of really great names, had an opportunity to do some time at Deloitte Human Capital, also worked for Culture which is another employee engagement platform in this space. And now I find myself at Qualtrics. And along the way, I've really developed an expertise on connecting different touch points to get a holistic idea of the employee journey and really helping answer that question of what makes people truly happy at work.
Wow, that's amazing. I have to say, I have worked with a number of the organizations that you've mentioned just before, and it's so incredible that the employee experience, or as you put it, the employee journey, which we often hear as the employee life cycle, which kind of seems transactional, but really the employee journey is an experience. So I like that phrase better. But it's so interesting how all of these major organizations and even just major companies that employ thousands of employees every year can all have an aligning and similar challenge. How do we keep people happy? How do we help them to find happiness at work? So I'm sure that you're going to say it's not a simple answer, but what is the answer? How do we ensure that people are happy or help them to find happiness at work?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think what you'll see if you look at the research from Qualtrics or companies like Gallup is there tends to be anywhere from like 10 to 20 different drivers that show up again and again as being the actionable things that can be done to help improve people's experience at work and have connections toward important outcomes like retention and performance and motivation and well-being and inclusion. But I think the thing that a lot of people miss, and it's really important to point out, is that the top 2 or 3 are going to be different for every organization. And that's where the magic happens, because you're able to answer that question for our workforce, for our people. What's going to be the thing that we can focus on that will make the biggest difference in terms of whether or not people are happy, motivated to go above and beyond, and want to stay with the organization long term. And that's if only everything was this way. The analogy that I like to give is that engagement or well-being or happiness or whatever those outcomes that you're looking to create within your workforce are, those are sort of like health indicators. If we were to use a personal health analogy,
right?
You have your lipid profile, your cholesterol, your triglycerides, you have your BMI, which is your weight and your height. You have some subjective measures like whether you feel like you can do all the things that you intend to do relative to other people your age. But you can't necessarily improve your cholesterol level just by willing yourself into having better cholesterol.
Just imagine if you could.
You have to do things like clean up your diet or exercise more or meditate or do all these different activities. And wouldn't it be nice if you could go to the doctor and not only could they tell you what your levels are, but they could tell you, here's the 2 or 3 things that you specifically, Tracy, according to your genetics, could go do in order to make these improvements. Now, we can't do that with our personal health, but with analytics, you have the ability to do that with your organizational health. You can know of all the things that could be done to improve the employee experience, paying people more, giving them ping pong tables, giving them more time off. Of all the things that could be done, what are those few things that are going to improve the employee experience and improve business outcomes? So it really gives you that gift of focus and ability to get the highest return on your action and investment.
That's really interesting. I'm glad that you mentioned that every organization is going to have its different priorities, because actually the perfect way to think about this in my mind is that you have to really know your population. You have to really know your employees, their needs, the environment that you are creating from an experience perspective, we've spent a lot of time over these last few episodes on my podcast talking about the growth mindset and aligning in values as an individual and with your organization, and that you have to kind of reconcile some things when it comes to matching values, because not every organization is going to value the same things that we necessarily do as an individual, and vice versa. You might not value the things that an organization does. So it kind of brings back this idea for me that, and I know we're going to touch on surveying, and I'm going to save that for a little bit later because I have some other questions to ask you. But, when I think about how we know our people and how we know what they want, a lot of what I have spoken about is that even when you think about like an hourly employee's experience, the person making the decisions for those hourly employees is not an hourly employee themselves. So how are you as a decision maker really making sure you're solving a problem for the person who's saying, hey, you need to help solve my problems for me? So it's an interesting way to think about that you can't focus on everything. You can't solve everything, but what are the priorities for your organization?
That's absolutely right. I mean, I think of a great example of that is two organizations working in the medical field. One was a network of hospitals and the other was a medical device company. And they were trying to understand how to attract more talent to their organization. For the hospital, it was nurses. For the medical device company, it was sales reps. And the assumption that the people that were doing the employer branding made was that nurses want more mission and purpose in their work, and that sales reps want more money. But when you actually looked at the analysis, you looked at the analytics, turns out that nurses always get a sense of mission and purpose in their work. So the thing that actually made a difference for them was things like compensation and work-life balance. Medical device reps always tend to get paid really well. And if you're a great salesperson, you can sell a number of different things and make really good money. But the main differentiator for them was actually that sense of purpose.
Wow.
So it's good to have a hypothesis around how you think people are wired, but you always want to test that against the data. And the most insightful things happen when it's something other than what you thought it would be, because that's where you're going to find the competitive advantage that other people aren't bringing to the table.
Right. I love this. This comes back to a point that is made often on this podcast, which is you have your beliefs and you have to challenge them. You have to surround yourself with people who think differently. You have to ask a lot of questions and you have to challenge the status quo. I love that it really, sometimes I'm sure for folks, it can feel counterintuitive because we've come up through an organization and we know what it was like when we were, at the working level. And I say that as far as entry level goes. And then you climb into a decision-making role and it actually can be very easy to forget what that experience is, but also the environments change constantly. And this is kind of what I want to allow us to segue into this next topic for us, which is getting into an analytical space within HR, within an organization. Now, I shared, I'm not an expert in this. Certainly, I do HR analytics. I have done that throughout my entire career. But there are actually specific jobs for folks who are really analytical and like to take all of this data and make sense of it for people who are maybe more on the front lines of HR and people facing more directly. So can you help the listeners to understand how they could, if they are interested in an analytical experience, how they could get into the world of analytics and people data?
It's really interesting because people come from a variety of backgrounds that work in the people analytics space. Some have a background in the social sciences like myself. So organizational psychology tends to be the biggest one, or some people call it quantitative psychology or psychometrics. And then other people come at it from a data science perspective. So maybe they have training in computer science or a strictly data analytics field. So maybe they're more programmer oriented and they know how to write code. And some people come at it from an IT background, but the data science background and or the statistics background and the social science background tend to be the fields that people have some sort of training in. And I think it's really interesting because people analytics borrows from each of those fields, and each has something that they bring to the table. So for instance, a lot of times people with a data science background might have more sophisticated analyses that they can do, but they may not necessarily have the context around why the numbers correlate or the story behind what they're seeing. Whereas somebody with a social science background or an org psych background might have more depth of understanding around the literature and the research and the why behind what's going on. So they might be more concerned with the methods than the actual stats. But when you bring the two together, it creates a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. So I think part of it is understanding how many different types of roles and things that can be done with analytics there are, and understanding the place where you want to play and what lends itself most closely to your talents and strengths.
Right.
A big part of it is just being a storyteller. Like, how can you take a pile of numbers and put that into a coherent narrative that makes sense to most humans? Like, that's a big part of it.
It's true. I love that. I love that analogy. And actually, I have had the pleasure of working with one person specifically that I'm thinking of, who was such an exceptional and is such an exceptional analyst that she could write a book. I mean, the way that she tells stories, the way that she takes the data and tells a story through her decks and spreadsheets and charts, it's unbelievable. And it's a skill set that I think she learned, from what I can remember, she's a former colleague of mine, she actually learned while on the job. Like, she never went to school for, any of these things, or it doesn't have the background that you had shared is commonly found in these roles. And she was in kind of like an entry-level HR role, and she realized that this was something she was kind of good at. She's unbelievable at it. I was like, you're being way too humble. You have to know your own strengths. And it's just incredible to see how, for me, she was a colleague of mine. So I was on the people-facing side of the business, interacting. I was in retail, so interacting with our store managers, district managers, et cetera, and above. And she was able to take all of the information that is basically, to your point, just a pile of numbers, and really tell a story that and having her as an ally in this way helped us drive priorities and focuses for the business that otherwise wouldn't be as compelling without the data. So these are really, to me, some of the most critical roles in HR. To have an amazing analyst, it's unbelievable.
I'd say that storytelling role and that translator role is in many ways the missing piece. There's a tendency to collect this data for the purpose of insights and understanding, which isn't a bad thing. But insights and understanding don't improve the employee experience, and they don't improve your business outcomes. Taking action on those insights is what makes those things happen. And if you're not visualizing the data, telling the story, and communicating that in a way that resonates for frontline people, you're really just spinning your wheels. And a lot of it goes back to something as simple as the words that we choose to use and where we place our emphasis. An example might be, people that are newer to this might say something like, engagement is 80%. Nothing wrong with that. But think about it if you say, 5 out of 10 people that we work with, or better yet, 8 out of 10 people that we work with, to use the same example, are giving that extra piece of themselves toward their work, right? To say that inclusion is at 70%, you can say, 7 out of 3 people feel like they belong here.
Right.
So putting the people first and talking about it in terms of, what are we really talking about here? We're not talking about a statistic. We're not talking about a number. We're talking about the sentiment, the experience, how people feel about their work and how they feel about us as a workplace.
Right.
And that subtle shift can make the difference between something that's just a cognitive response to something that's both a cognitive response and an emotional response, so that you're actually compelled to do something about it.
Oh, I love that. And if there's anything that we know in HR, it's that we need to always and constantly reiterate and remind believers and non-believers that not only are we here to stay as a function, but that we're business leaders and we're an imperative part of the business. So if you can find a way to not only have the data, but also the emotional response and understanding and appreciation that you're sharing, Kevin, I mean, that's everything. It's literally everything.
Reminds me of a quote from an L&D leader I worked with. If we could tell people something one time and they remember it, we'd all be out of a job. So that repetition is super important.
Yes, it's really true. And actually, I think the natural next question is, okay, well, we have to get this data from somewhere. And in getting data, we're either asking a lot of questions or we're receiving a lot of inputs from a lot of people, because you have to, in order to have really interesting data, you have to have enough data points to make it compelling and to ensure that it's statistically significant. From what I can remember from my grad program, that is somewhat accurate, I hope I'm remembering correctly. But statistical significance is really important. And so to boil this down, if we're getting data from people, that means we have to be asking those people questions, but not only questions, the right questions. So let's move into this idea of surveying. I know we're going to touch on this idea of drowning folks in surveys and having too much data collection, asking too many questions potentially. So where do we start? How do we ask the right questions? Is it that we need to know what we're looking for first?
Yeah, great questions. I think the first place that I would start is to say that surveys aren't the only source of being able to collect people data. So there are proactive as well as passive listening channels. And an example of that is Glassdoor. There's a lot of data about your organization that sits on that website that you didn't actively collect, but you can use to act on. Every time somebody is onboarded within your organization, there's data that's being collected. There's information that's sitting in your HRIS. And if you think about employee listening and improving the employee experience as being a conversation and a relationship, it'd be really weird if you and I were to have a relationship, but only one of us asked all the questions.
Yeah.
And if only one of us was ever to initiate the conversation. So always on listening channels are another venue that you can have. At Qualtrics, as an example, at the end of every all hands, there's a QR code that flashes. That's an opportunity to give feedback on that particular all hands meeting. You walk into one of the restrooms and there's a QR code to give feedback if something needs to be fixed. A lot of organizations will have web intercepts on their intranet or on their expense report portal so that you're constantly improving the digital experience. Now, the caveat to that is that if you're going to have these intercepts where the data is being collected, you have to have a person or a system on the other end that's actually acting on that. And sometimes it can be a system. Sometimes it could be opening up a ticket in ServiceNow to create some sort of automated process, or opening a ticket with the custodial staff so they can clean up the bathroom. It doesn't necessarily have to be a human being, but there either has to be a human being whose job it is to follow up on those things, or some sort of process whose job it is to take action on that. I would also say that when it comes to surveys, one of the things that people in the customer experience world do a much better job when it comes to surveys is they think about how can they make the feedback collection part of the experience so that it doesn't feel like it's extra work on top of the experience itself. Every business trip that I go on, I probably do like 7 surveys and I don't even think about it. I take a survey on the Uber trip to the airport. There's usually some sort of feedback system at the airport itself. I finish my audiobook on the plane and rate the audiobook on Audible. Then I take a lift back to the hotel room. There's usually some sort of survey as part of the hotel check-in process. I order some food on DoorDash and I rate the driver. And then I go back to Yelp and I rate my food.
How have I never thought about that?
And the reason we don't think about it is because it
Yeah.
feels like it's part of the experience and it feels relevant to what's happening, right?
Yeah.
So pinging people with constant questions about how are you doing? How are you feeling? Isn't really actionable. But if you're in the process of onboarding and someone asks you if you have your laptop, if you've met the colleagues that you need to meet in order to do your job well, have you had a level setting conversation around expectations with your manager? These are all very relevant questions that you're eager to give feedback about. So being intentional about measuring the subjective experience along all of these objective happenings and being intentional in what you want to understand and help people with along the way can make it so that you don't even think about these surveys. It just feels like part of doing the thing.
Wow, that's really interesting. This was a light bulb moment for me to realize how baked in the surveying experience is just in standard, regular, everyday life. I mean, the moment you mentioned Uber, I'm like, oh my gosh, when I rate it 5 stars, when I rate a driver, and I always rate a driver 5 stars, even if it's not a 5-star ride, because I'm like, you know what, overall, great experience. And when I think about that to your point, this is part of the motion of being connected to a business or an experience or a platform, especially in a remote world, because that's immediately where I go because I work fully remotely. I'm asking myself now, as you're sharing this, well, how do I provide feedback in the as part of just an everyday muscle movement? And if not, there's a miss there, because actually feedback, everyone can say that their company appreciates feedback, but until feedback is given every single day, how much can we appreciate it? Because we're only getting it during certain moments. So I'm thinking about all of these moments in my experience, whether as part of the decision-making process or on the receiving end of a decision-making process. When has the feedback been part of that motion versus part of capturing 3 months after something's been done? And there's always a loss of value when something is after the time has already been spent. So this is a really, I don't know, it feels like really on the nose, like something that I should have realized years ago, but actually this is the value of having conversations about this.
You're not alone in that epiphany, right? I think a lot of people are saying, okay, how can we take that feedback to action cycle and tighten it up to the degree possible, right? I think one of the big challenges when it comes to acting on this data is that organizations sometimes overemphasize formal company-wide actions and process changes. And those things can take a long time and they can be really, really risky. So a classic example that I like to use is you find out that recognition is an area for improvement. Find out that if you recognize people better, they'll be more motivated, they'll stay longer, they'll serve their customers better. All the things that you want to have happen seems to be driven by recognition. One approach that some companies will take in that instance is, okay, let's go out and buy a brand new recognition software. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. That could have a huge impact, but there's a whole process associated with it. And then by the time that you implement everything and communicate it back to your employees that we're doing this as a result of the feedback, they might have forgot that they even provided that feedback to begin with. But a manager writing a handwritten note saying thank you to her employees, that can happen within days of closing the survey. And in many ways, it can be just as impactful, maybe even more impactful than that software system. So how do we build that muscle around quick action that will yield us immediate results, not instead of doing the big organization-wide things, but in addition to, so we can get that quicker action, that closing that loop and building that muscle over time and seeing immediate improvements rather than having to wait 3 months where the data might be stale.
Right. I love that example. I mean, this is the emphasis of agility in organizations, and so much, especially as organizations grow, so much of feedback comes around like this, a feeling of bureaucracy sometimes, that things are not quick to action. And most of the time I've seen that feedback really from HR professionals because there are all of these desires to improve experiences. And it's like the weight of the world on some of these folks, especially if you are, operating as a lean team, which many of us often are. It's like, how can you, sometimes it's too daunting, it's too burdensome to think about that big project. And so I really like this concept and idea and reminder that we don't have to overcomplicate things. Sometimes the smaller, what feels like smaller actions make incremental changes for the long run. And to your point, I mean, two things can be true at once. You can do that handwritten note, which if you go back a number of episodes, there was a guest who actually talked about how this was the best way that he's ever recognized his team is through handwritten letters, because of the impact that it has for the receiving party. So two things can be true at once, and we can also realize that this is a reminder for not overcomplicating things and just kind of like coming back to the basics.
Yeah, and Marshall Goldsmith, he's a big leadership coach, and one of the things that he advises some of the leaders that he coaches is to stop providing so much value. And I think part of that is true for HR too, right? It's like maybe you're actually gonna get more done with less work by deputizing the other leaders and other managers and other parts of the business to take on some of this stuff that's traditionally thought of as HR stuff. Your job as a people leader is to lead people, and your job as an HR expert and leader is to help facilitate other leaders to get better at doing that on their own. Not to say that you're going to go away. You're always going to be there as a resource to help, but ultimately you want to teach other leaders to fish rather than continue selling them the fish. And it's tempting, right? Because, hey, you feel important to be busy and to be the one involved in all those things. And that's how you add so much value. But sometimes saying, no, these are your scores. This is your data. This is your feedback. What are you going to do to improve it? I have some ideas. I've talked to a bunch of other people leaders, and I can tell you what they've done, but ultimately what's going to make the biggest impact for your leadership and for your part of the business. Right.
It's the driving mutual ownership that really allows the organization to thrive. And actually, this is something that I think is so important, and we're going to dig in even deeper on this. But just to reiterate here, I mean, you're absolutely right. We are a major pillar of our roles is to support and facilitate others, leaders in their own right, to be able to encourage and enable better performance, better engagement, better experience. And really, it's managers who are impacting employee experience mostly the most, really, or most often. And I think that understanding is really important. And I wanted to segue this. I'm so glad you brought this up, because I was looking at my notes from when we first spoke, which was many months ago. And you might not remember this, but we talked about this perception that employee experience is an HR thing. And my role, my title is Director of Employee Engagement. So it literally is my thing. But also, if you ask me offline, I'll tell you my job is no different today than it was when I was a director of HR. I'm doing the same thing because that's how I see my role. It's about facilitating and elevating leaders. But the thing is, it requires the leader at any level of organization, whether you're a small business, nonprofit, doesn't matter. Those leaders have to understand the ownership that they have over their people and their employees' experiences and how that all connects. You can't have one team with terrible employee experience or engagement, perceptions, and another with an amazing experience and expect those two teams to work really well cross-functionally. I mean, you're just going to have a breakdown. So let's dig into this. Like, tell me more about what you mean about that perception, and let's really dive into this idea.
Yeah, so I like to use the shorthand ABC 1 2 3, and no, I didn't get royalty rights from the Jackson 5 to use that, but action oriented for the A, B is business relevant, and C is conversation based. So I think it starts with A, setting the expectation that there is going to be action associated with anything that we're doing. right? We're not having this program. We're not giving you this data. We're not sharing these things with you for the purpose of you having an aha moment. We want you to have the aha moment, but we want that aha moment to inspire you towards some sort of action. So a lot of that is also related to having that action-oriented mindset. This isn't some sort of manager evaluation exercise. We're not showing you these numbers to give you a report card. These numbers are the speedometer on a car. It's information that helps you adjust your behavior to help you get where you want to go. So it's all around the action. We're beginning with the end in mind. We're beginning to think about what's the improvement that we ultimately want to make. What are the decisions that are coming up, and how can the data and how can this program help us make better decisions? So I think that's the first piece when it comes to enabling managers and leaders to become owners of this and not having it be an HR thing. The second piece is the B, the business relevant component, helping people see what's in it for me. I think a lot of times we think through our own lens. As an example is, we want to improve our onboarding experience. Okay, well, that sounds good. It's also through kind of an onboarding lens, which sounds very HR related. Mm-hmm. But if we talk about it in terms of, we want your salespeople to hit quota sooner, right? We want mm-hmm. our call center reps to stay for at least a year, because we know it takes them 9 months to onboard. So we need at least 3 months of productivity out of them, or we need them to ramp sooner. So we want to improve that ramp process, right? So thinking about it in terms of business relevance, putting our recruiter or salesperson hat on for a second and saying, how can we use the terms that the rest of the business uses? How can we get inside their head? How can we match up this experience data with that business data and that operational data? Another great example is a huge retailer. And I know I'm talking a lot about onboarding, but I just,
it's a great example.
It's a great example.
Yeah.
They had so much turnover and they were hiring so many new people, and they were trying to get their managers to speak with these people before they actually started their first day and set them up for success. And they simply asked the employees as part of the onboarding process, what did your manager do to connect with you before your first day? And there's a number of different ways that people might connect. They might connect over a text message. It might be a phone call, might be an in-person meeting, might be a Zoom call. The only one that made a positive difference on people's engagement and belonging was either an in-person meeting, a Zoom meeting, or a phone call. An email, a text message, not talking to them at all had a negative impact. And the cool thing about that is you can go back to those frontline managers and say, we know what very specific behavior you can do to make sure that people will actually stick around, so that you're not constantly playing whack-a-mole and having to hire and onboard new people. So it's really business relevant, right? Because frontline managers working in retail, they're thinking about the person that called out. They're thinking about the customer that's yelling at them. How do you put it in those terms so they say, oh, okay, this is not just information. This is helping me solve my immediate problem. So that's the business relevant piece.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, this is where the business acumen is such an important, I want to say, skill for HR leaders to have. And this has been a full circle moment on the podcast, which is now 2 years old. And it started with like HR and other business leaders. And it took some realizing, well, actually, wait a second. HR leaders are business leaders. There is influence on the business. So now the listeners who have been here for this journey hopefully are thinking about, okay, well, yeah, I am a business leader in my own right. Now, how do I drive the piece of the business that I own, which is the business, the people? Who else is driving the boat, right? It's all of these people coming together to impact an organization at an organizational level. Again, I know that I have listeners who are in nonprofit and small business, mom and pop, bootstraps types of businesses as well. But all of these businesses have the same common denominator. 99.9% of businesses are run by a human being. At some level, there are human beings in organizations. The robots also need to be managed, right? So at some level, we're talking about people. And so if every listener can think about that, how, to your point, when you can understand what motivates the leader that you're speaking with, then you're able to tell a story that's relevant to them, help them to understand why these metrics, these drivers are critical to their success. That's truly the only way. And I can tell you from personal experience, I worked at Target in the beginning of my career. I was in store as an HR manager, and I was there about 4 years. And I remember vividly, and I've taken this with me in every part of my career, that in the first 6 weeks you do your training, and the most important thing that you do, that you have to take with you through that training and when you get placed in your store, is to get the buy-in from your colleagues and from the team. And why is that? This is not some like Target revelation or Target mumbo jumbo. This is like a critical part of leadership, period. And that is understanding your audience, being able to market your message, share your story, tell your story in a way that's relevant to the listener, and to be able to focus on building really strong relationships, which, to your point, coming back to all of this discussion around analytics, when we ask these questions to understand the data, to understand where people are, so much of that could just be in a regular conversation that you're having with someone on your typical Friday lunch meeting, just having a conversation.
I love that. It's so interesting because the C is conversation based. And I don't know if you contrived that or if it just happened to flow in that direction, but that was perfect.
Great. Totally contrived.
I learned a new term recently, which was "you're taking me to church." I don't know if you've ever heard anybody say that, but when you were talking about how HR is the business, I wanted to just like say amen, because that's so true. And it does break my heart a little bit when I hear HR professionals talk about the business. It's like, oh, no. We're the business too. We are the business too.
Yes. And you know what? I think that there is place or a time and place now in society and organizations where HR leaders don't necessarily need to make as much noise around that. I think because of COVID and everything, every business relying on its people leaders, on its business leaders to support their employees at every level of their experience, that now it's like, oh, wow, what would we have done without our people leaders, without our HR function? And so maybe there's a little bit less of needing to scream this from the rooftops. But at the same time, coming back to this first point that we made earlier, you have to be able to tell a story. You have to be able to take this data and allow it to stand on its own, so that there is you can't argue, you can't debate data. Now, of course, you can have data, and I'm sure you could do a better job of explaining this. You can certainly have data paint the picture that you want to paint, but you can't paint that picture without some sort of data. So you're still collecting information that helps to prove integral points, whether it's even saying, hey, we need to increase salary ranges because of, needing to be more competitive in the marketplace. How now companies are having an easier time doing that because of pay transparency laws. So you're not necessarily going to need the same searching and finding for information, because a lot of this is now available because of changes in society, changes in politics, and now businesses, of course, are able to kind of take that and run with it. But the next frontier for organizations and business leaders is to drive up and elevate what already exists. So I think I bring up pay transparency because it's front of mind, especially for those of us in New York. But actually, every candidate, every active employee is sitting on the sidelines like, oh, this is so great, because now I see that our main competitor is paying $20,000 more. Wow, this data is so helpful to me. I mean, this is kind of fundamentally what we're talking about.
Absolutely. And I actually like, and I find it a lot more helpful when you go in with something that you're trying to prove or disprove. Because you can really get lost in the weeds of all the data when you're just taking an exploratory approach. What can we find? What's out there? And there's a place and a space for that. However, I think going in with what's the hunch that I want to confirm, or the myth that I want to bust, can be a lot more powerful, because you're already going in with a story. hey, our leaders are talking about making some radical changes to our pay structure. And we have a lot of opinions about what should be done. How can we go in armed with data that will be the tiebreaker in some of those discussions? And it's not always a matter of black or white. Sometimes it's a matter of to what degree, right? So yes, pay is important. It's always going to be important to some degree. But under what conditions is it more important than others? And what can we do to make it more or less of an issue depending on what strategy we'll want to take?
That's really, really compelling. I guess my next question in really processing what you've just said is, let's say someone listening is maybe like a party of one at their organization, and they are the only person in HR, and they're carrying the world on their shoulders at this point. How can they take potentially what might be limited resources to make an impact that does translate to better or more improved employee experience? How do they take the information that's available to them to tell this story, to help them answer questions and drive forward the organization in a way that is factual and not just based on feeling?
You hit the nail on the head earlier when you talked about understanding your audience. And I actually think it starts with the storytelling skills before it goes to the data skills to identify who are the stakeholders that have decisions to make, and what will most influence their decision. What's their persona? What's their typology? Are they a big-hearted leader? Are they a data-driven leader? Are they skeptical? Are they visionary? What language do they speak? What things do they talk about all the time? Is there a familiar refrain that you hear them referring to again and again? Is there a particular chorus or a talk track that they like to use? What's keeping them up at night? What are their goals? And then after you have that really clear in your mind, think about where that data can come in to help influence or help them make a decision one way or the other. And going back to that idea of what myths need to be busted, what hypotheses need to be confirmed, and how can you start to collect data in the first place? So a lot of people think that this is a math exercise, and there's math involved, but a lot of it is more about curiosity and asking the right questions. So what's the question that you really need to have answered? And I think that's the first place. And then what's the simplest way to answer that question with the data that you have available? Or maybe you need to have some sort of new listening channel or way of collecting that. But what's the simplest way that you can collect that data and explain it in order to help make that decision? And that, when you do that, you radically simplify the process of thinking about this as some big math problem, when really it's a people problem, and the math just helps you solve that particular problem.
Right. This has been an amazing discussion. I really appreciate you helping us to better understand a realm of HR that has not been broached yet on this podcast. And, I know I keep coming back to this, but it is really important that these discussions help us to understand different ways of thinking and different opportunities that are afforded to us as business leaders in an HR function. So I feel like you're going to end up being back on the podcast at some point, because I think I'm going to have many more questions once I go back and reflect. And then even when I go back and edit, I'm going to get to think about it all over again. So I just really appreciate you being our resident analytics expert and helping to broaden our understanding of this. So thank you so much. Where can the listeners connect with you?
Yeah, find me on LinkedIn. Also check out the XM Institute, which is the thought leadership arm of Qualtrics. Lots of blogs, lots of content, lots of learning material there. And you can find me on LinkedIn, Kevin G. Campbell. It's easier to find me with that middle initial. And then XMP is one of my designations, which just makes it easier to find me. Look for the Kevin G. Campbell with all the letters after his name. No PhD there yet, but I figure if I get enough other credentials, it'll just sort of add up to one.
Yes. I love that. And I will link your LinkedIn also in the show notes to make it super easy.
Yeah.
But Kevin, thank you so much again. And I'm sure that all of the listeners are just totally mind blown and inspired and ready to go and be the original influencers of business that they are.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.